we wanted to talk about because the Democratic National Convention is this weekend, or excuse me, it's starting early next week. I think it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of next week. And so this episode will drop on Sunday, just in time for that convention. So it would be prudent to kind of talk about probably the most infamous Democratic National Convention, the 1968 DNC that happened in Chicago. And so the reason we want to talk about it is a couple times. One, it's pretty interesting history. If you are unfamiliar with the history of the DNC of 1968, it's pretty interesting.
I'm unfamiliar with it.
Yeah, I'm excited to kind of just be this more of a story time with Tyler kind of thing, and I just kind of tell you story time with Tyler, and then also, yeah, let me see. This one is going to be Monday, the 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd. So Monday through Thursday of which I assume is next week. So our DNC will start, and I'm actually going to be following this pretty closely. I've learned a lot about the DNC, like in researching and preparing for this topic. I knew the history of the DNC a little bit. I wasn't like a super expert. I'd watched like some documentaries about it, and I was just kind of vaguely aware of it. But in the researching for this little session, I was looking up like more of the history of the DNC, and now I'm a little curious to actually watch this process, because if there are echoes of what happened in 68 today, we'll talk about what those echoes are. History kind of repeating itself, and I want to know like if there's any kind of drama or controversy that happens now as it happened then, because like kind of to tease what's happening is there was an unelected vice presidential candidate who kind of swooped in and just took delegates without anybody ever voting for them. That's what happened. That I could be describing the 2024 election, but that is what happened in 1968, as well as the big rift among left voters or people that would vote for Democrats. I'm gonna pause my disdain for Democrats this episode and this episode only, and use terms like when we would vote for Democrats and stuff like that, knowing that I would probably never vote for a Democrat. But Democratic voters at this time were really torn between the war in Vietnam, because there was just a massive, what could arguably called a genocide in North Vietnam at the time. The amount of bombings that were taking place.
Cambodia, to be
yeah,
honest.
the amount of bombings that were taking place in the I don't know what the actual word for that peninsula is. I want to say Indochina Peninsula, but that's not right. That's the old imperial name for it. Whatever that region's name
Southeastern
is.
Peninsula.
Yeah, just a Southeast Asian, I guess. I'm sure there's a name for it. Now I feel kind of dumb, but anyway, the
Hey man, I'm the one with a degree in geography too.
Fair enough. Well, it was called that. It was called Indochina for a long time when it was under control by the French. But it's what is Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam today. Which I always found interesting. A separate sidebar. Those are three different countries that are neighbors that have three wildly distinct forms of government that should be like diametrically opposed to one another, and yet they're very, like, as I understand it, they have really good relations and really good trade policies, and just like they're the three best friends that anyone could have. You have a communist country, a monarchy, and a democratic republic country all next to each other, and they're just friends. Anyway, that's just a separate conversation. I'm pretty sure kind of Cambodia is a monarchy, Vietnam is a communist country, and Laos is like a democratic republic.
I don't know if Cambodia is like a monarchy. I know they have like
I thought it was. I could be wrong.
It's like it's kind of like England, where it's like
a constitutional monarchy.
A constitutional monarchy of some sort, but is it a real constitutional monarchy?
Well, back to my point, the war in Vietnam was what was kind of really separating Democratic voters. There was a huge rift in the party, and there was pro-war candidates and anti-war candidates at the Democratic National Convention, and that was kind of the big beef. And it was not unlike today. You have a lot of people saying, "I'm not going to vote for a Democratic candidate that supports genocide or funds or arms a genocider in Gaza and Palestine." And at the same time, then you had a lot of people saying, "Well, I'm not going to support a Democratic candidate that supports bombing North Vietnamese." So you had that vice presidential candidate kind of swooping in, stealing the election, stealing the primary, the nomination, and while being split over a foreign war. So it's just there are shades of the 68 convention today, and so maybe we can learn something by diving in and kind of taking a look at it. And that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to try to make it not super boring.
Also, it's still called the Indochina Peninsula.
Is it still called the Indochina?
It's still called.
I felt like that was it, but I didn't want to be like using outdated terminology.
The Malay Peninsula.
Malay Peninsula. Isn't that just lower? The Malaysian islands? Is that what you call it? That's Malay?
Malaysia and Singapore and Thailand, that small peninsula, That's its own peninsular strip. It's like a peninsula that's coming out of a peninsula.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Peninsula squared.
Yeah, exactly. Peninsula squared.
Yeah.
The peninsula to the second power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so it is still called the Indochina Peninsula, though.
Correct.
That feels vaguely like old school imperial. Like it's like
Yeah.
you know, like something when something is Oriental, you're like, that doesn't really sit right, you know.
Oh, yeah,
a
like
little
Oriental massage. I still see
Yeah.
those around. Something like.
Yeah, it just feels very like Orientalist of like that kind of like, you know. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is, do you have some?
I was gonna say, on Thursday is something happening at the convention.
The final day?
Yeah, is there something spectacular?
I
that
think
happens
that's
there?
typically that's when like Biden will finally show up. Typically the presiding kind of like president isn't there, and they save like the big heavy hitters for that final kind of closing ceremony. Once the nomination has finished, you
When
have
does
the
that
nominated
nomination
party.
happen?
That happens over the 3 days. Typically, it takes a couple days for the delegates. There's multiple rounds of voting. The delegates pledge to their thing. There's voting. There's deals or trades are made, and like yada yada yada. It goes back and forth. Finally, a nominee is selected, and then on that final day is when they make their address, and like when Biden or the sitting president will come and make their address if it's that party's candidate. If it's not that party's convention, it would be like Obama or somebody who's like the grandfather of the party or whatever.
I wonder if it'll happen when we film our next episode. If we
I see what you're saying.
go for a live.
It will probably be just a boring closing speech.
Well, we could talk shit while we're
Yeah.
doing live.
You want to do live?
Yeah, why
on next
not?
Thursday?
Yeah, why not?
Fuck yeah, I'm down.
Yeah, because we'll talk with just random shit about live, whatever's going on,
Yeah,
but
hell
we'll
yeah.
watch it
I'm
at the
down,
same
brother.
time.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Cool. Yeah, that could be fun. I think I might be good for next Wednesday too, if you are. If whatever's easier for you.
I'm specifically working Thursdays now too, and getting off at 3:30 just so I can come here. Right afterwards.
Okay.
But whatever. If Wednesday works better for you, I'll come Wednesday.
Wednesday doesn't work better for me. Wednesdays are my late days at work. I
Yeah.
don't get here until like 6. So like I'm just saying, if it's better for you,
No, Thursday
is better. Let's keep it Thursdays. Then.
Yeah.
All right.
Thursday is better.
Anyway, let's kick it off. Let me get started. So let me set the stage with a little bit of background information. A couple things. LBJ had announced that he wasn't running. Well, first of all, LBJ ran. that's like LBJ didn't announce that he wasn't running. Lyndon Baines. Okay, let me back it up even further. If you don't know what I'm saying by LBJ, say you're like a non-American listener or something, or you're
Limited blowjob, man.
limited blowjob. No, Lyndon Baines Johnson was the president leading up to the 1968 Democratic National Convention. He won his election in 64. After assuming office in 63, when JFK, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated, Lee Harvey Oswald shot him in the head, Dallas, Texas, November 1963. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was the vice president. He takes over. He assumes the presidency in November of 63. Finishes out his term, wins re-election. I forget against Barry Goldwater, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, Republican Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater loses in one of the most one-sided electoral defeats in history.
Thank God, because who
Barry
the fuck
Goldwater was
wants a fucking president named Goldwater?
Well, he was also a total piece of shit.
Yeah.
People in Arizona love him. I'm from Arizona, and people love him there. There's a bunch of bullshit named after the Barry Goldwater Highway and shit. There's Barry Goldwater everything there around there, but he was like kind of like fashy. He was pretty fashy. Anyway, he won 6 states. He won Arizona and a couple southern states. He had like 40 electoral votes to like 480 or something. It was a fucking blowout. And a lot of that was coming off the heels of the JFK assassination, because JFK was loved. LBJ kind of represented this legacy of JFK. He talked about unity. He was a pretty popular, strong politician. He didn't really get along with Kennedy too much. He was an old school Southern Dixiecrat, kind of like hardcore. Like LBJ was a fucking hardcore guy. He was physically overbearing. He was a big guy. He was notoriously brutish and bullying. There are tons of like anecdotes and stories of how he would like take meetings in the White House bathrooms during his presidency. He would take a shit with the open doors while staring people, right? Like he was supposed to have a meeting with, like staring them in the face while grunting and dropping out turds, because it just put people off their game. He was notoriously crass. He burped. He farted everywhere he went. He would just scratch his balls. He was like just a fucking awful person by all accounts.
The one that gets me the most is like the accounts of him like walking into the bathroom, standing right next to the other person, by the urinal, right next to the next person.
Yeah.
And then just be like, "You want to see something?" And just whoops out his dick, which was apparently like a fucking elephant.
Yeah, his monster schlong.
Yeah, his monster schlong, and just starts like whipping it around.
Yeah,
like it's
he was by all accounts a psychopath, and like just a like kind of like what you would consider now like an abuser, and like like
I'm sorry, but like I can't imagine like walking into a fucking wow, this is so cool. I'm in the White House, blah blah blah. You're in the bathroom, the fucking president walks in. It's like, oh shit,
scratching his ass, scratching his balls. Yeah,
like the president's walking in. Oh my god, it's like, oh, this is such a bad place to meet the president. The president's like, hey, want to see something? Just whips out his dick and starts fucking swinging it around like it's a fucking rope.
If you want to pause this episode and just Google or YouTube LBJ orders pants. And somebody has animated Lyndon Baines Johnson, a recorded phone call of LBJ on the phone with like a tailor or like a pants company ordering pants, and you'll get no, they were pants. They were like slacks. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. They were like dress pants, like slacks. And I guess he had a pair that he liked. He found out who made them, and then he called that like manufacturer, and he's like, that pair you like, I want like 6 pair more, 8 pair more, or whatever. And the phone call is recorded, and that'll be a perfect. I encourage you, pause this video, pause this podcast, and go look that up. And it's like a 2-minute video. Somebody animated it on YouTube, and it's just kind of this old timey audio recording of him on the phone. And he's burping, he's farting, and he's just like talking about his nutsack, like he's just talking about his bunghole, and it's just like, and it's all in this deep Southern drawl.
You have those pants.
Yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like, and that's a pretty good.
I want to stretch out at the fucking. Where,
he's like where the seam goes down there, where they always cut off my nut. There's like cutting my nutsack, and he's like let him out a little bit. Yeah, it's he's a pretty funny guy.
If you can stretch those out for me right down there, it's like I'm sweating down there, just sitting down. I'm fucking.
Well, I will say all of this wasn't known to the public at the time, largely, and he was an incredibly popular candidate. He crushed Barry Goldwater in the '64 election. He went on to run for 4 years. He could have ran again in '68, and then he decided not to. Before he decided not to, he just kind of like didn't announced that he wasn't running. I think he won Maine, or he won a state in New England in one of the early primaries as a write-in candidate. He wasn't even on the ballot, but he was so beloved that he won the state as a write-in candidate. And then he officially announced that he wasn't running. And so then it became an open primary in '68, and you had a few people kind of throw their hat in the ring. One was RFK. RFK Senior.
Yeah, not that RFK you're thinking.
Was actually
this lizard man.
Who was actually like a beloved politician. RFK was like a civil rights activist. He was anti-war. He was anti-Vietnam. He was, by all accounts, kind of not the front runner per se, but he was kind of like the presumed winner. It looked good for RFK. You had this guy named McGovern and another guy named McCarthy who kind of were later in, and they were. I think McGovern was anti-war. I want to say McCarthy was also anti-war. I think everybody was anti-war at this time. And because Vietnam was not going well. It was like this was '68. The sentiments around Vietnam, there was a lot of protests at home. There was a lot of civil rights protests happening. A lot of riots were happening in the street. This was a time of extreme civil unrest. '64, '65, '67, there were a lot of riots all over America. Martin Luther King's death caused a lot of riots. There was all the MLK riots happened after his death. So like America was kind of like in a sour spot right now. People were divided. People were pretty anti-Vietnam generally at this point, and so a lot of that was reflected in their candidates. Well, then RFK is assassinated in, I think, June of that year of '68. And so that leaves kind of like more trauma and more divisiveness when it's RFK. He was like the big champion of civil rights. And like he had the Black Panthers, like the black vote was kind of locked up with RFK because he was like kind of almost like this legacy kind of candidate that was like, obviously legacy because he was JFK, he was a Kennedy, but also like Martin Luther King, he had worked with and like he was kind of championing that civil rights movement after Martin Luther King had died. He was kind of like carrying that torch almost in a way. Yeah. Not entirely, he was a white man, but he was the face of kind of the last civil rights or the next generation of civil rights movement, along with a lot of other like actual prominent civil rights leaders. I don't want to take away from like civil rights leaders at the time, but RFK was the Democratic politician representing the civil rights movement.
And LBJ took over after Kennedy was shot, right?
Yeah. JFK, yeah.
JFK.
Yeah.
So,
who, not for nothing, to give him credit, he wasn't like an extreme anti-civil rights guy. Like he did push a lot of civil rights package through, although I think albeit like hesitantly. I actually don't know a ton about that.
Yeah. Well, all I was trying to say is it is kind of suspicious that you have at a certain moment JFK dies and then LBJ takes over, runs an entire term, and then he does drop out eventually, but then when RFK runs, he dies too, just to have. It just sounds like LBJ is just conducting this shit. You know what I mean?
I don't know any. I know the conspiracy theories surrounding JFK's death and how the CIA probably had a large hand in that. RFK was killed by a man named Sirhan Sirhan, who I believe was Palestinian. Yeah, a Palestinian killed Sirhan Sirhan. So like that's just kind of in a weird coincidence.
Yeah.
He was
Why?
I don't remember. I don't remember the reason he killed RFK Sr. He was oh no, I'm sorry. His sort of citizenship was Jordanian, but I think that might have been because.
Well,
but he was born in Jerusalem.
Well,
in Palestine.
with the was it the It's called.
It was an anti-Zionist assassination. I think RFK was a Zionist.
Yeah.
And so that says the motive was anti-Zionism. Was Sirhan Sirhan's reason for assassinating RFK?
But it also sounds like that's like a setup. Like they knew.
I don't know. That's a little deeper than I have.
You need
time
that fucking tinfoil hat. God damn it.
I'll circle back on that and maybe I'll check back in because that might be relevant because he was a Palestinian who had Jordanian citizenship and that assassination revolved around the nature of Zionism. So maybe that is a relevant topic to come back to. In any case, you now have no kind of clear nominee for president in 68. So there's two parts of the story. There's the political side that actually is happening at the Conrad Hilton Hotel in downtown Chicago, where the DNC is being held. And then you also, on the other side, have the anti-war protesters that are starting to kind of pick up momentum and start gathering in Chicago to protest just in general the Vietnam War, but largely just kind of that's where the DNC is happening. So they're there as anti-war protesters. To back it up a little further, in Chicago, you have a guy named Charles Daley, or Mayor Daley. I think his first name's Charles. I can't remember his first name. His Mayor Daley. He's mayor of Chicago. This guy is old school, like party boss, like Tweed level, like legacy. I mean, this guy has like he owns Chicago politics. His kid was the mayor of Chicago. His like all of his kids and grandkids and nephews have all been like
nepo babies.
They're like, but I mean, this is like old school. This is one of the last like party bosses of that kind of Gilded Age, right? This guy is one of those guys. He he rules Chicago with an iron fist, and he wants to. He lobbies. LBJ wanted the convention to be held in Houston. He felt that it was important to kind of retain that Southern Dixiecrat Democrat voting bloc. It was at this time the Southern strategy was about to kick off in full swing, and this is kind of when Democrats and Republicans did that party switch, where Democrats at this time were like white conservative segregationists in the South, and Republicans were by and large, prior to this anti-slavery, it was the party of Lincoln, the kind of like the anti-segregation party. Well, this is around the time that party line switched, or one of the major switch happens. Part of Nixon's Southern strategy was convincing Democrats to vote for him, a Republican, because he was anti-black, basically, and that was their voting issue, right? They were Democrats, but they didn't support civil rights. And so, ironically enough, the third candidate in this election of 68, to spoiler ahead a little bit, was George Wallace, the Alabama governor, who was like the one who, the fire hosing of all of the Birmingham, the Selma, the guy who let the dogs on him, that incredible segregationist, like a hardcore racist. That was the third party who got 10 million votes. In that he ran as an independent in the 68 election. He got 10 million votes. And this also was whereas the previous election in 64 was one of the furthest or the biggest landslide victories, this one was one of the closest in history. I think it was 120,000 votes is what came between the two candidates. But I don't want to spoil, I guess. I mean, it's Hubert Humphreys and Richard Nixon, and then Richard Nixon wins in 68. So like
spoiled it. What the fuck, bro? Now you don't even have to watch this anymore.
You can't spoil history. So I don't know. I'm kind of spiraling. I'm kind of sprawling. Anyway, Charles, can you look up his name? Is his name actually Charles Daley? I've been reading about this guy recently, and I'll
call him Charlie.
Charlie. His name is Daley. I got it. Mayor of Chicago Daley. It was Richard Daley. Sorry.
So Dick Daley.
Dick Daley.
Dick Daley.
Wait, is this hold on, this might
Double
be this
D.
No, Richard Daley is the scene. Oh no, they were both called. He was Richard Daley Jr.
Dick Daley Sr.
Yeah, it was Richard Daley, not Charles Daley. My apologies. Richard Daley runs Chicago with kind of an iron fist, and he lobbies for the DNC to be there instead of where LBJ wants it to be in Houston. He gets his way. There was a really successful DNC there like a few years before this where FDR won, and so there was kind of this legacy of Chicago being the place where like Democratic candidates are like kind of like he wanted to be seen as like the kingmaker, and he was like he wanted to show off how like smooth he rolled his city. He just wanted it was just an ego boost. He wanted just the media attention to see how smooth Chicago was. And so to keep it smooth, he brought in 6,000 National Guardsmen. He brought in 11,000 Chicago cops that were forced to work 12-hour like rotating shifts. And he surrounded the hotel where the DNC convention was in barbed wire and chain link fences, and it looked like it was like a siege occupation with the amount of like a police state with the amount of police and National Guards, barbed wire, chains, dogs, like it was on lockdown. And so while that DNC was kind of that was shaping place, he also was getting wind that there was going to be a large protest action. A lot of protesters were coming, a bunch of different groups, the SDS, the Yippies, and then MOBE.
What the fuck's a Yippie?
So the Yippie is the youth. It was Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman's group. These guys, they were kind of like the most radical and like more like performative is not the right, like performative has a bad connotation, but these guys were like I don't know. What did it stand for? This is not hippie. Yippie, dude. What the fuck? They were anti-war. Hold on, I'm gonna pause this for a second. I can't find what it was. Youth International Party. It was a little political party. They were called Yippies. They were like youth-oriented, radical, anti-war, kind of more anti-establishment. They weren't necessarily like anti-capitalist. They weren't communists per se, but they were just kind of like anti-establishment, anti-war, just counterculture revolutionaries. I mean, this was like, if you know like this culture of like Allen Ginsberg. No, I mean like like Allen Ginsberg, the poet. This was like the Beatniks, the Bob Dylan. This was that era of like guys standing around writing poetry, smoking weed. Not to like take away from like their movement. So not even
sock them. It's just a little lesson.
I don't know about like I wouldn't try to like equate them with modern politics. I don't know their like politics exactly, but they were like a pro-peace, anti-war movement primarily, and they were led by a couple guys primarily a couple guys named Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin.
Hoffman.
Just a guy named Abby Hoffman, who they were very charismatic. They were very like flamboyant. They performed a lot of stunts. They did a lot of like press releases, and they brought a pig down and like had a pig there called Pegasus, I think, that they nominated. They had their own mock DNC where they nominated Pegasus for like, and that got news, and they were all arrested for that, by the way. And I think the pig was captured too. Anyway, they were like constantly pulling stunts and just being goofy and shit. Yeah. And then the SDS were Students for a Democratic Society, and then MOB was like the there's a lot of acronyms at all these like student groups or youth groups basically. And these are all anti-Vietnam, like anti-Vietnam political groups, like kind of different.
My question is were there any like anti-capitalist groups?
Yeah, I assume there were. I actually don't know. I should have like clarified, I guess. But I assume that a lot of these people were anti-capitalist. They were flying flags. They were taking down American flags and putting up Vietnamese flags during these protests. Yeah, now, whether or not that was done in solidarity with just the larger anti-war movement, or whether or not they were like pro-communist, they were labeled as communists. Like the police were heard shouting, yelling at them, "Kill the commies," while they were tear gassing and stuff. They were like labeled as communist agitators by like the police and by the politicians and stuff. So like they were labeled as communists. Whether or not they actually had political, I know that there were a lot of CPUSA people there. I know there were a lot of Communist Party people at this event. I'm pretty sure Joe Sims was here. Joe Sims was here actually, I think.
Fuck, bro.
He sold. But my point is that yes, there was a anti-capitalist pro-communist movement here, but the main part of the story, the main players in the story, SDS, Yippies, and MOB, I don't think they're necessarily anti-capitalist in nature. But I could be wrong. I didn't go too deep in the actual history of they were the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, or MOB. The MOB. because they were called the MOB.
Like mob, but the MOB.
Just the mobilization, the MOB, but their
Yeah.
official name was the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. Anyway, this story's going off the rails. So you have a lot of riots across the country. You have a lot of protesters heading to Chicago to protest this thing. At the same time, you have a fairly conservative, hardline, authoritarian, no mischief, no nonsense mayor who like hates the youth and hates these damn hippies and these commies. And so he's primed and he's given orders to shoot on sight any protester that he sees like carrying a Molotov cocktail or like
Jesus
damaging
Christ.
property. Oh yeah, he was hardcore, and so that's one of the reasons the violence escalated so dramatically in this story.
Shoot on sight.
Yeah, that was apparently an order he gave to the Chicago police, was to shoot on sight anyone that was like, I think there was certain like criteria they had to meet. Like if you saw anybody with a Molotov cocktail, they were allowed to shoot on sight, or they were ordered to shoot on sight. The protesters. So you have all these groups coming. Oh, another reason things got kind of out of hand was he did not allow any permits to be issued. So like all of these people applied for permits to like camp in the park or to put up like events, like hold events in the park. They had like their protest permits and stuff. They tried to get the rally permits. They tried to get just to stage any kind of like action. They tried to get all these permits. Well, the city of Chicago denied all the permits leading up to this. And so like I forget his name, Renton, I think is his name. He was the leader of the SDS. He's kind of famous for saying like, we're coming to Chicago, whether or not you give us a permit is irrelevant or whatever. So it's like, you should give us a permit. And that was part of like, there's a later trial where they were all arrested for like federal crimes for this riot, where like that was kind of came out during this trial of like their position was that like we applied for these permits. We wanted these permits to avoid violence, because if we're there legally, then there's no like there's no confrontation with police. If we're camping in a park overnight, like a park closes at sundown or whatever, the cops will have to come by. We will have to say no, and therefore violence will ensue. If you had just issued a permit, we would be there peacefully and there would have been no violence. So like they claim that it was because of his hardline like anti-protester attitude that's where the violence came from. Yeah. Which, I mean, they're not wrong. So anyway,
well, that just shows that at that point the establishment, as always, has been anti-free speech.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, and that is evident also inside the actual convention. There will be moments where reporters are beaten. Dan Rather was there and was pushed down and punched by like security and police inside the convention when it gets a little rowdy.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, I guess the Walter Cronkite was on the like other end of Dan Rather was reporting from the ground at this time. And those guys are fucking old as shit, because Dan Rather was like just reporting recently. I think he just died. But anyway, Dan Rather was inside with his goofy little headset reporting from the ground, and Walter Cronkite was back at the studio. And Walter Cronkite is heard over like the air saying like they're just a bunch of thugs, like calling out the cops as thugs, and like it was pretty contentious all around. Okay, hold on. Let me try to like find us where we're at. And the Chicago police were also already pretty violent police force. They're the police force that will go around and execute, kill a bunch of people and execute Fred Hampton the following year. They assassinate Fred Hampton. This Chicago police force. So like they're already pretty violent people. So the SDS, the Yippies, everybody arrive. The reports vary on how many tens of thousands or how many thousands were there, but it's well over 10,000 are on the streets of Chicago. They're at a place called Lincoln Park. It's about 5 miles north of the convention center. That's where they're kind of set up. Well, the park closes at 11. And then the police roll by and try to get him out. Some accounts say the police didn't even try to talk to him. They just opened fire with tear gas and just started like blasting tear gas and mace into the park. And then it just kind of all hell breaks loose. If you've ever been at one of these like BLM rallies or whatever, like once the police start tear gassing and macing people, organization kind of falls and people are just sprinting. Police are going around with billy clubs, just cracking skulls left and right. It's anarchy. Not much happens that night. The following night, it's the guy who is in charge of SDS, Renton, I think is his name. He decides that like it would be more visible for them to march to the actual convention center. There's a place called Grant Park, which is just across the street from the Hilton there, and so that's he's like, if we want to get our message out, if we want to like take a stand here, we can't be miles away from the convention center. So they march to, or they don't march all the way there, but they reposition their whole event out front of the convention center. So while that is going down, then that's when kind of the police really kick it into gear. That's when the rioting actually happens. Also, I should say at this point, all of these groups were heavily infiltrated by every type of law enforcement.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
There's reports of it was like sheriffs, state police, local Chicago police, FBI, even and illegally the CIA had infiltrators within all of these groups, which is illegal because CIA is not allowed to spy on Americans in American soil, but they still did it.
But with how crass somebody like LBJ was,
Yeah.
like you're
Oh
not
yeah.
surprised.
There's a movie about this, which it's written by Aaron Sorkin, and so it's kind of like liberal in its like glorification of like the American dream and like, you know, like America coming out on top. It's called The Trial of Chicago 7. It's about all of these leaders. The lead, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, the leaders of MOB, the leaders of SDS, the leaders of the Yippies, and Bobby Seale, one of the Black Panther leaders, were all arrested after the fact and charged with like a whole bunch of like federal crimes. Like they would do federal time if found guilty of like inciting, crossing state lines to incite riots, to like do sedition, all kinds of shit.
Yeah.
Like they really wanted to crack down on these guys. In the trial, they were all found guilty. Well, not all of them were found guilty. Some of them were acquitted, but like the judge was like incredibly corrupt and like sent everyone to prison for like multiple years for just contempt of court. They gagged and tied Bobby Seale to a chair. They didn't let Bobby Seale have a lawyer, and he was eventually granted a mistrial after like a long time of trying because the judge wouldn't allow him to have a lawyer, which is pretty un-American, pretty unconstitutional. And it was just like the judge was
right though.
He does, but the judge was incredibly crooked, and also people now think he might have been going senile, and he was later disbarred, and like he was investigated later. This whole story is wild. Like every aspect of the story is like crazy. Like if you start pulling any one of these threads and follow it, it leads you to another weirder story. Like the whole Fred Hampton thing, the whole Daley thing, and then like this whole trial of Chicago 7, which is kind of a separate story. They were all arrested after the fact for this protest or this riot that's about to happen. I understand that as I tell the story, we're like 45 minutes in and I'm all over the place. So I hope you just kind of bear with me. No, we're 45.
What?
Yeah.
There's no way.
We're 44 and 42
God damn
seconds.
it.
Yeah. So all of these groups, they're there. Hubert Humphrey slides his way in. He says, you know what, I'm going to get in on this. I'm going to jump back and move away from the protesters and go back to the political side of this for a second. So Humphrey takes edge because of huge donors, because of this party boss position that Daley has, because of the insider. He lends his support behind Humphreys. And so Humphreys kind of collects a lot of these delegates without ever a vote being cast for him in primaries or at the DNC, and he kind of becomes like the face. That political rift, again, it's all about the Vietnam question. It's all about just pro-war versus anti-war. And Humphreys is a pro-war candidate. He's a very he's not all that hawkish. He's just kind of a LBJ stooge, and LBJ didn't want to tampen down Vietnamese actions. The question at hand right now in Vietnam was there were Paris peace talks between Vietnam delegations and American delegations. In 1968, there were talks of a peace, which would have ended the Vietnam War long before it actually ended. The North Vietnamese only condition was to suspend the 24/7 bombing in North Vietnam. Like that was their starter of like, we're not even going to come to the negotiating table unless you just stop constantly bombing us. Which, not for nothing, is a pretty fair thing. It's that's like if you're trying to have peace talks, you should stop your incredible bombing campaigns.
Exactly.
And remember, more bombs were dropped in Vietnam than like World War I, World War II like combined, I think. Yeah. It was like brutal bombing campaigns.
Don't forget to mention Cambodia at that point.
Yeah.
Too.
Well, so the North Vietnamese were like, that's our thing. Stop bombing us, and they refused and say, no, that's a non-starter. We're not going to stop bombing you. And so the peace talks were kind of falling apart. And Humphreys originally was like open to that. He's like, if it means peace, let's consider this. But the party line at the time from LBJ and from the pro-war Democrats was like, no, not at all. We're not going to stop bombing them. They were pro-war. They didn't want to appear weak on it, especially fighting against a Republican.
Yeah.
Because meanwhile, in Miami, the Republican convention happened, and it was smooth and boring. Nixon was nominated. It was a unified party. Everybody was on board, and it was good to go. Not unlike Trump and the party that just happened in Milwaukee or whatever.
And then also on top of that, we have the whole the Israeli
exactly
the Israeli conflict with Palestine right
that's
now
what I'm saying.
Gaza, and it's just like, wow,
that's what's separating the party.
Similar.
That's like where that's why people are kind of saying like this is very reminiscent of the 1968 DNC. So Wednesday is the big day. The official nomination happens, and the biggest protest happens at Grant Park. The official nomination happens after a few rounds. Humphreys is declared the winner. Humphreys is now the presidential, or the Democratic presidential nominee. While that is happening, the biggest kind of clash at Grant Park happens from the police, and so this is kind of when there's something called the Walker Report, which I believe was done by it was a Los Angeles police investigated and kind of audited this event and like reviewed it and released this report of like what happened here. And this is I'm quoting from the Walker Report here. Quote, unrestrained and indiscriminate police violence on many occasions, particularly at night. That violence was made all the more shocking by the fact that it was often inflicted upon persons who had broken no law, disobeyed no order, made no threat. These included peaceful demonstrators, onlookers, and large numbers of residents who were simply passing through or happened to live in the areas where confrontations were occurring. So this has been described as, and the kind of term was coined, a police riot. This was like what you see today, and what you often see is you see a group of like unruly and unorganized people for whatever reason, whether they be the January 6th riot attacking a place and police, or whether it be like a BLM protest that turns into a riot. It's always the non-police that are typically kind of like the rioters. I'm not saying for right or wrong, I'm just saying that's usually how it goes.
Yeah.
This was actually a very unique time in history where it's kind of the opposite. The protesters were fairly like polite and civil and kind of like peaceful. And there's photos of just the police. The police were the ones just chasing people down in the streets and just cracking them over the head with clubs, dragging people left and right. Like the police had no order, no organization, no discipline. They were just indiscriminately sprinting around the streets of Chicago, just beating people. And as you heard from the Walker Report, which was like an independent like report on this, indiscriminately beating people. If you lived in the area and just happened to be like getting groceries, doesn't matter. Police were just there, and there is footage of this, and I highly encourage you to go look at it. There's a lot of footage. This entire thing was televised for the nation to see, of just the police just going. It was like they were in a frenzy, man. They just like went nuts, beating the shit out of people, breaking bones, cracking skulls everywhere they went. It was nutty.
Can you imagine being some grandma just like trying to go get some milk?
Yeah,
you're trying to make some dish.
You just live a couple blocks from the convention. Boom,
and you're just walking by, some guy just hits you right in the fucking head. Granny Smith.
It was nutty.
Dead.
Yeah, tear gas, mace, the whole nine. I mean, it was pretty violent. Meanwhile, inside, there's a lot of reports, and obviously the inside of the convention is not as violent, but it's just political kind of blustering. But one of the guys who was anti-Humphreys went up to kind of call him out, and that's the clip we watched of like saying like, you know, if you support McGovern, one of the candidates, you won't get this. He called it a Gestapo tactics of like the Gestapo police, basically like hunting innocent protesters, kind of a shame on you type thing, saying it to Daley and to Humphreys, and he's not wrong, you know. Inside or outside, they're being peaceful protesters are being beaten, while inside dissenters are being silenced and kind of being forced to support somebody who like wasn't really in the part of the campaigning process. And apparently Daley yells to this senator, I think he said, "Fuck you, you Jew son of a bitch," is what some people have said, have like lip readers have determined is what he read, because you can't actually hear him yell it. And then he had his like goons, I guess, go up, and I don't know if it was this senator or somebody else that was speaking in kind of an anti-Daley or anti-Humphreys, like the anti-war Democrats. He had his goons kind of go up and like shuffle them off stage and like push them off stage and stuff. So like they were like dissenting voices were kind of silent to this. If you weren't pro-war Democrat and like you did not toe the party line, you were kind of silenced and like bullied off the stage. And so like there was a lot of shoving and pushing, and there was for the first time in history, there was like an incredible amount of security inside the convention that was like kind of intimidating and harassing anybody that would kind of speak out against the war. So like inside and outside, they had kind of like planted like a no protest, no right to speech. And again, there was a public display of police attacking press here, which again wasn't the first time this had been like televised, but it was the first kind of time people had really like seen their eyes like open to like Dan Rather being pushed and punched by police and other members of the press just being attacked and silenced, which is kind of again an un-American thing to do. And that was kind of live on television. However, all that said, national polling after this, Daley got a boost, and Nixon won this election in a landslide. Or no, this was I'm sorry, not in a landslide. This was a very close election, but Daley got a boost for this. the American people felt that he did a good job with the protesters. They thought they were like un-American, and like it was just all spin, and people kind of sided with the police and sided with the establishment on this one.
Jesus Christ.
So looking now, if you look at the current DNC in
damn, bro, boomers even back then.
Boomers even back then. Police bootlickers even back then. But now, ahead of the DNC next week, a lot of the buildings are all the businesses in that greater area are being boarded up, and they're like preparing for this DNC of like, I think there's going to be there was huge protests at DC. There have been huge protests everywhere Harris goes, and she was in Phoenix, I think, last week, and there was huge protests stopping Harris speaking. It was like Harris isn't welcome in Arizona protest kind of thing. I imagine this DNC is going to be heavily protested. And I would imagine.
And what the protest is going to be about is the war, right?
Yeah, it'll be pro-Palestinian protests. Where is the convention happening?
Yeah,
I was actually looking it up. I actually don't know. It'd be funny if it was in Chicago.
Is it in fucking Chicago?
It's in Chicago, Illinois.
No way!
I think that's another reason. I probably should have known that. I think that's another reason why this is it. History is repeating itself. You have a vice presidential kind of stealing the presidential.
Way.
The party is torn between pro-war and anti-war in Chicago. A smooth Republican primary where the Republicans are kind of unified by and large. And so here we are.
No way.
And so that leads us.
Face, you just looked up at me. I'm like, no.
Chicago.
No.
So that leads us to Monday when the DNC kicks off, and we're gonna see what happens. I assume there are a lot of local organizations that are planning to protest and show up in support of Palestine and support of Gaza at Chicago. I assume there's a lot of businesses I read that have been like boarding up and like getting in preparation for this.
I wish it was in Seattle. I would go.
Yeah, I don't know. See, I think Illinois is still a swing state. So like there's a benefit to have it. There's a benefit to having your convention there. Like there's no reason for anyone to ever campaign in Washington because it's locked. Like Democrats will always win.
The only way that it would unlock, I guess would be the correct term for it. I don't know. The only way it would actually have any sort of like sway out of the Democratic Party would be to the left from here, to be honest.
Yeah, I would think that like that's kind of what we talked about last week of like it would be cool if their numbers dropped from what they usually would be. Like if they usually win by X amount of percent, it'd be cool if they win by less than that. I
could totally see if in like 10, 15 years that like Seattle itself starts voting like 10, 15, 20% like in a socialist party.
Yeah, like a Debs type thing of like coming in and taking some of that leftist vote. You know,
PSL, like actually getting like
I hope so. I mean, I hope that people show up for Stein and or Claudia and Karina. Like, I mean, that seems to be the two kind of like parties the leftists are going for.
They should combine forces.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Obviously, it's not the same party, but like,
yeah,
have everybody put their,
Yeah, that would require one or the other to drop out and endorse the other, and that's not going to happen. So yeah. Anyway, I don't think. Let me look over my notes. I don't think I have too much left that I didn't get to. Yeah, I said, I kind of started talking about that movie. The movie The Trial of Chicago 7 tells this story of like the this entire thing. So it starts with it mainly focuses around the protest. Well, it mainly focuses around the trial of these 7/8. Bobby Seale was later they later called it a mistrial, so he was let go, and then it became the Chicago 7, and it's called the Chicago 7. They're called the Chicago 7. It was a really famous trial. There's a bunch of different documentaries about it, and then Aaron Sorkin wrote and directed this movie about it, and it's written by Aaron Sorkin, who's kind of a lib. So it has liberal elements to it. I will say though, it's pretty good. Oh, I should also disclaimer: it also has Sacha Baron Cohen, who is like a raging Zionist as the lead. He plays Abby Hoffman, the Yippie.
Which is ironic as fuck.
Yeah, Eddie Redmayne plays Renton, I think is his name, who was the SDS leader. It's good. I mean, it's a good movie. It's Joseph Gordon-Levitt's in it.
I just don't understand why they would hire Sacha Baron Cohen for that role.
Oh, I mean, this movie came out before. This movie came out years ago.
Oh, did it? I thought it was.
Or I mean, like 2020 maybe, something like that. So
okay,
like,
but this was
before this
the
most current uprising of like anti-Zionism. Among the left. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that's it. I don't think I have anything else from my notes. I recognize that was kind of told out of order, but it's just a really interesting story of like American history. It's just
sometimes if you tell it in order, it kind of it doesn't give you like the full context.
Yeah, and it's also you going back and forth. It's like a Quentin Tarantino movie.
Yeah,
it's artistic. It's an artistic storytelling style. I don't know. Did you? I mean, did I? Do you? How do you think? What do you think? Any questions you have? Did I miss anything? It's funny we've been going for an hour.
God damn, man! Like there's so much going on.
It's a fascinating part of American history. It's like I genuinely mean if you like take
and then LBJ dropping out what was the reasoning for LBJ dropping out?
I don't know actually. I think he just
he
said it. He said it in his he made this address I think in March of '68, or maybe April. I don't remember. He went on radio TV and he kind of like announced to the American people that he was dropping out, and I think he also at that time called for like the need to end the war in Vietnam. I think he may have implied peace, but I don't know exactly. I could go back and rewatch that.
Yeah, I don't know. All this shit's crazy to me, and it just such that coincidence of it being in Chicago again.
I think I knew that at some. I think I must have known that at one point. That's why everyone's kind of like talking about the '68 DNC is because it's like it's mirroring, it's echoing it completely.
The one major difference I do have to say between '68 and now is they're kind of fucking set on the on the presidential candidate thing.
Yeah, it's obviously a little different. There is no kind of like other Democrats that are going to be. I would imagine nobody serious is going to challenge Harris. It would be nice to see if like
running as an independent. Right?
Yeah, it would just be nice to see if like there was somebody else challenging the Democrats, because like it might not be as contentious on the floor of the DNC
But the outside is what
the outside will be for sure. There's definitely going to be violent protests or violence against the protesters outside of the DNC.
Chicago has a large. What party was really like? The leftist party was really like big in
Black
Chicago.
Panther Party. I mean, that was Fred Hampton. Yeah,
of course. But there was another like was it CPUSA, PSL? Who was it?
I don't know. CPUSA, has always had a really strong presence in Chicago.
And then, DSA,
that's where the CPUSA National Convention was just held this summer.
Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Except they're a bunch of fucking libs too. I'm not afraid to say it.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.